Welcome to this new episode of the Africa CEO Forum's Fair Climate Transition webinar series. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith, and we will be looking this time at Green Deal's African terms. Now, Africa has to shape its own energy transition. They need to work out and pursue the models, priorities, and partnerships that can deliver a Green Deal rooted in the continent's realities are only becoming more pressing. The shaping of its energy landscape is a delicately strategic balance of climate issues, job creation, and inclusive societal and industrial development. African ownership of how this plays out and contributions to the global conversations about action and understanding about green transitions is not a nice to have. It's the very foundation of understanding and creating a plan that has any chance of working for and on the continent. So to dive more deeply into all of this, it is my pleasure to be speaking to today Mike Sangster, Senior Vice President for Africa at Total Energies, Thierry Ebro, CEO for the Mauritius Commercial Bank, Shakira Karolia, the Ministerial Advisor for the Ministry of Energy and Electricity for South Africa, and Tony Tiu, the CEO of Renewables in Africa. Thank you all so much for making the time to come and help us unpick all of the tricky issues that are at the heart of this question about how to make sure that any green deals that are cultivated for the continent are done so on the continent's terms. Mike, so I'm going to start with you first. What is your take on big oil and gas players like Total Energy's place in global conversations about Africa's energy future? Do you see any room for improvement about the way those conversations are currently being conducted?
Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, thanks for the chance to join this webinar today. I think it's a really important subject to talk about. Clearly, energy or access to energy, I think is one of the key challenges for the continent. I think it's generally accepted that, the more people that have access to energy, the higher the human development index is for any country. And we all know that Africa has a challenge in that 600 million people that today don't have access to energy on the continent. So, Total Energies, we're an energy company. We provide energy. Our role is to provide energy to our customers in Africa and in other parts of the world. So, I think Africa is very important for us in the sense that we produce a lot. We operate about more than 1 million barrels of oil equivalent per day on the continent, and we think it's a very important economic driver for the continent. So, the countries in which we operate, I think it creates a lot of jobs. Highly qualified, well-paid jobs. It generates a lot of revenue for the governments and taxes and royalties and production sharing. So, and I think through that enables the government then to invest in their programs, which could be related to to health, education, and so on and so forth. And also, again, if we're talking about an energy transition or a just energy transition, then I think the investments in oil and gas, the revenues from oil and gas, can then obviously be used in the way that we, Total Energies, as an organization, we're using the cash flow coming from our traditional oil and gas operations to invest in renewables across the world, including in Africa. So I think providing energy, low cost energy, low emissions energy in a sustainable way, I think is key to the development of the continent. So we're very proud and very happy to be part of that in Africa.
So much, Mike. So, Thierry, I'm going to come to you next. Now, essential to fueling any transition is finance. Do you think that the African private finance sector should have a bigger role in both framing and defining the climate finance agenda and coming up with practical solutions to the African energy problem? And if that input was ramped up, what do you reckon would be different about the kind of conversations being had?
Yeah, thank you, Georgia, and good afternoon, everyone. Actually, I would like to complete Mike's presentation of the sector. I think when we are speaking about the financial sector and financing energy in Africa, we just need to remind what is Africa. Mike said 600 million Africans have no access to electricity. At the same time, Africa represents less than 4% of the gas emission right now. If you take the G25 alone, it's 25% of the emission. Africa is counting for 1.4 billion inhabitants right now, out of which more than 40% is the use of this planet. In 2050, Africa will count 2.5 billion inhabitants. 70% of the population will be less than 35 years old. When you put that in perspective with the continent, you understand that energy will be key to transform the continent. And when we speak about the energy, we speak about for what to do for the transformation. At the same time, Africa is, let's take some sectors, the metals and minerals that we all need for the electrification of this planet. Africa is counting for 30% of the reserves of metals, minerals, rare earths, which are needed for batteries and electrification. I take just, cobalt. RDC is representing 74% of the supply of cobalt in this planet. 97% is exported in China and essentially as raw material. Africa is exporting raw commodities in agriculture business, in metals, minerals, in oil and gas. Africa is exporting crude, importing refined products. So all that has to change. The continent has really to start moving back to the continent, the value chain, the added value of the productions, and improving its own development and its own capacity of importing less finished product, producing and supplying the whole continent. So for us, this is when we speak about the energy in Africa, this is what we are speaking about. So we will need for years, will or not, a mix of energy which will be fossil fuels and better gas than oil, better oil than coal, and of course we better oil than wood, which is still used in Africa, and we will have to accept that. At the same time, we will have to develop renewable energy. It's perfectly possible. You take Kenya itself, 90% of the energy produced in Kenya is renewable. So, Africa is really on this field part of the solution. What the financial sector has to really do to support this transformation is to explain what is this transition of the continent which is needed. So I used to say we do not speak about decarbonization when we speak about Africa. We speak about responsible carbonization or low carbon development for the continent. And we as a financial sector, we need to work together. We need to work with international players to explain what is a transition of the continent, what it is needed, what are the funding needed to support this transition and this financing, which will not address only renewable energy, but which will address social, economic development in the continent, which is for us key in the ESG agenda, energy, social governance. The S for us is a priority, and we need to move international funders to understand this transition and to be part of financing this transition, including what the North doesn't like, fossil fuels, which is a part of what we will need it for the continent.
Thanks so much, Thierry, for that breakdown. Shakira, so how do you respond to Thierry and Mike's take? Does this reflect your feelings about Africa's energy roadmap? Because South Africa is currently the president of the G20. How is it using that position, and specifically the Energy Transitions Working Group, to ensure a clear vision, clear African vision and leadership on energy transition priorities on the continent? Shakira, can you hear me? Oh, okay. So it looks like we've had a little glitch in the system. When does that ever not happen? So we're hoping to get Shakira back shortly. But as our team works on that, Tony, first of all, what is your response to what you've heard so far from Thierry and Mike? And, when we were speaking ahead of this conversation, you were really flagging up that, Africa offers unique resources and advantages to this global Green Deal conversation. That sounds lovely, but how do you apply that concretely in terms of a meaningful approach to Africa's role in the green transition in places where decisions are being made?
Excellent. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I just want to start by saying that I want to share a few words of support to my fellow Cameroonians who are actually going through a very difficult period after this post-electoral time, and hopefully that's fine for me to say that. Now, coming back to the question that you've been sharing here, so I've heard what Mike and Terry have said, and I think I understand where they're coming from, and it's important to have a conversation with all the different key stakeholders of the continent. I would say that for me, we're not just talking about energy transition as a slogan. It has to be a contract. And for Africa, as far as I see that, the question is simple. So do we just sign other people's contract, or do we start writing our own? This is the question that we need to ask ourselves. And in saying that, there's three different points I want to sort of talk about here. So I want to talk about the local value add. For me, it must be a non-negotiable, right? And when we look at, for example, the Ben Solar Park, that's in Egypt. So that's a 1.6 gigawatt project with a very transparent feed-in tariff, and it has created 10,000 construction jobs and deliver power at $3 per kilowatt hour. So what does it prove? It proves that renewables can build industry, not just dependency. So that's an example of how concretely we're making difference on the ground. So reliability, that's the word that I regularly hear from people. Definitely it's the new equity, I would say that. So another major project, so we can talk about the Lake Turkana wind project. That's a 210 megawatt. That's the largest wind project on the continent. It provides 17% of the national supply. I know Cherry was talking about earlier on of Kenya getting 90% of the energy from renewables energy, and it's correct. And project like the one I mentioned, the wind project, it cut the reliance on thermal power and is helping to lower the wholesale cost by about 9%. So we can see that here, and with grid stability, we can also support an industrial users. Yeah, that's the second example of how things will be done on the ground and making difference as we speak right now. I also want to talk about the African capital. It must be in the room. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about having local banks. I'm happy to see, obviously, the MCB, so obviously in the conversation. Pension funds, how can we bring them into the conversation? And also having diaspora investors. I believe all of these people, important, they should hold tranches, because this is how we're going to keep both the value and the governance in the continent. So essentially, when we talk about project coming to the continent, especially for renewables energy or energy transition, for me, the litmus test must be very simple. So this question should be, does it build local industry? Does it ensure reliability? Does it include African capital? So if the answer is no to that one, so I don't think we talk about fair transition, it's just another import. So that's how I would tackle the question that you've asked.
Thanks, Tony. That's super interesting. Shakira, I believe that we have you back. Is your mic on? Are you good? Are you ready to join us? You good to go?
Yes, I'm good to go. Despite all the checks and testing we did in the beginning, it decided to disconnect.
That is always the way. I am 100% sure our audience has experienced this themselves at some point or the other. But it's good to have you back so we can get your take on this. So we've heard Thierry, we've heard Mike, we've heard Tony. South Africa, G20 president, what is that? How is that impacting South Africa's work in trying to pull together the continent in terms of leading energy transition? And also tell us a bit about how your energy transition working group feeds into that.
Thanks so much, Georgia, and hi to everyone joining us online. It's really seminal that for the first time, the G20 is chaired by an African nation. It's for the first time that the African Union also sits as a permanent member of the G20. I think that this is something that's not just symbolic, it's historic for the continent. We could see, another 10 to 20 years before the G20 returns to a developing country, having come from Brazil, India, South Africa, and prior to that was Indonesia. So this is like, for South Africa hosting the G20 Energy Transitions Working Group, it's really, whilst it's an honor, it's also equally a solemn responsibility. It's a responsibility to ensure that Africa's voice is not merely, just an echo in global corridors, but something that guides us. And it must be that guiding compass in our energy transitions working group. So we entered the G20, in the towards the end of the year, in the beginning of the new year. The Energy Transitions Working Group, each Sherpa group of the G20 would share, key priorities with G20 members for acceptance and inputs. Prior to us even going to G20 members, we first, through the AU, with assistance from the AU and the AU's leadership, we first consulted African energy ministers. So in January of this year, we took our proposed priorities to African energy ministers, 3 priorities that I'll get into. And in that particular session that we had representation from over 40 energy ministries on the continent. We did a similar thing towards the end of our G20 Energy Transitions Working Group as well. So, we really entered the G20 on this basis where it is a matter of justice for us. It's, energy being the justice issue of our age. We've seen that it's not a right. It's the key that unlocks so many things, whether it's social or economic aspects. And this is where access to, affordable, reliable, and clean energy is not a privilege. We reminded that global transitions must be of global benefit. And this is why we highlighted energy justice as being, almost the moral compass of our deliberations within the G20 Energy Transitions Working Group. It was about recognizing that climate ambition is not something that is detached from developmental ambition. It's about ensuring that every worker in the energy value chain and beyond that energy value chain, due to the economic spillover effects of energy access, whether it's a coal worker in Mpumalanga in South Africa or an entrepreneur, a young female in Lusaka, that each find their rightful place in our energy economy. When we talk about energy transitions, as we move away from fossil fuels, we must ensure that we do that on a pace and scale that is sustainable for us, and also that we do not move away from people. So our Energy Transitions Working Group had 3 priorities. The first was really centered around energy security with affordability and resilience. So this really spoke to the fact that no household and no nation must ultimately have to make a choice between darkness and debt. The second priority, speaks to just and inclusive transitions. And this is, really premised on the fact that climate ambition cannot be purchased at the expense of jobs and communities. That is the way we position it from our perspective. Of course, G20 nations all have very different perspectives in this regard, but we did manage to reach alignment in the end. And our third priority, which is, a G20 first in an energy transitions working group, was an African priority. So this focused on African interconnectivity and energy pools. And here it sought to link our power pools into a continental grid that essentially transforms borders into, bridges of shared prosperity. So in this instance, we, with the AFDB and the African Union, we worked on a 10-year infrastructure investment plan, which is a legacy of the G20, South Africa's G20 Energy Transitions Working Group. So this 10-year infrastructure investment plan aims to connect, the corridors from North Africa to the Cape, from Inga in the DRC to the Indian Ocean. And ultimately, it advances the goal of electrifying 300 million people by 2030 under Mission 300. We know that over 600 million people on the continent do not have access to electricity. 1.2 billion do not have access to clean cooking. Those are not small numbers. We are the most energy impoverished continent on the globe. I mean, there are other facts, stats I can get into. So it's more than just infrastructure. For us, it was a vision of solidarity and represented a new deal for global cooperation. So we also, the last point I'll make is that we're of the view that energy justice must become, our new currency of this energy transition that we're facing. And we also called for reforms. My former panelist spoke to the international financial architecture, and I think those are extremely important points, because we called for reforms of the international financial architecture. Moving from rhetoric to results, the unfair risk premiums that are sometimes, many a times actually imposed on the continent, and from, risk aversion to a notion of shared responsibility.
Thank you so much, Shakira, for that really thorough walkthrough of all the issues from the African perspective, and that really exciting setting out of what the ambitions are in terms of work being done by South Africa as it is during its presidency of the G20. To dive more deeply into this process of balancing industrialization and energy access, Mike, I'm going to come back to you. So recently, Total Energies announced that its LNG project in Mozambique would be restarting. More widely, when it comes to the African continent, what is the vision in terms of integrating natural gas into the energy mix as the continent pushes towards industrialization?
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. Gas, clearly is an important fuel for the continent. I think it's widely accepted, that gas is a transition fuel. It's one that can be, a segue, from the kind of fully fossil fuels into a more renewable world. And we heard earlier on about renewables and reliability. It's clear, I think, as well, that you need some form of quick starting power as well. So we think gas-fired power is something that's very complementary to renewables. In fact, it's something that we do in many parts of the world. We'll invest in renewables, but we also invest in gas-fired power. Then I think for Africa itself, again, a lot of countries have gas reserves, gas resources. Not just oil. And I think again, it's something that can be used. Obviously, traditionally it was used for export, and I think, as Thierry said, I think it can be used more and more as well for the local economies. So in places like Angola, Nigeria, gas initially was seen as a bit of a byproduct and a wasted product. Then they developed LNG projects, Angola LNG or Nigeria LNG, where it's exported overseas. But then I think more and more we're seeing a good domestic market for gas. Like somewhere like Nigeria, for example, which is huge gas resources. We're supplying gas to fertilizer plants, to power plants, and even to a mini LNG plant, which is then providing gas to all over Nigeria, and especially up in the north, where they don't have any resources. So, I think gas can be used as part of the overall energy transition. And I think clearly for the continent in Africa, given the lack of access to energy, access to power, I think gas is clearly a fuel which can be used, to expand the availability of energy. And I think the second thing is worth mentioning there as well. I think it was Shakira that mentioned it was clean cooking, because again, in many of our projects, our LNG projects, our gas projects, we produce a lot of liquefied petroleum gas, LPGs, and I think it's something that cooking with wood, obviously, in an enclosed environment, apart from the emissions issue, it's not very healthy for everyone involved. So I think if we can develop much more liquefied petroleum gas, LPG projects, and deliver it to the final customer, I think our objective is to have over 100 million customers, by 2030, and we're going to invest some $400 million to achieve that. So we can produce the LPG, we can bottle it, and we can deliver it to the final customer. So again, it's a fuel that can be used, it can be produced in Africa, and it can also be used in Africa and put to good use, in fact, in Africa. So I think it's important that we continue to develop our gas business, not just for export, but also for the domestic market.
Thanks a lot, Mike. So any prospect of changing the current energy mix needs financing. Thierry, in your experience, what are the main differences between the private and public financial sector's behaviors when it comes to financing energy projects on the continent? Do you think that these differences affect the rate at which energy access is growing?
Well, actually, we need both. And when we speak about private sector and public sector, I would say local private sector, local public sector, international private sector, international public sectors. I think all the actors must work together on a same agenda. And this is probably where are the differences that we need to understand and to accept. As a Mauritian bank, I can lend long-term in my currency in my country for financing long-term project in energy. As a Mauritian bank, I am not able to finance long-term project energy in other countries in Africa because I do not have access to the foreign currency, to the dollars, to the euros that would be needed for this financing. This is where the international funders and the public sector, the public finance sector, can bring to the table these long-term funding which are needed. We need DFI, so the Development Financial Institution. Today, the limitation I see in this exercise is, first of all, the DFIs, international, are considering the agenda of the transition in energy in Africa as a decarbonization agenda. If I take Mauritius, I have easy access to funding, for example, from Proparco, but I mean, this is a funding used for financing renewable energy projects. I need in my country, in Mauritius, funding, long-term funding in the adaptation agenda of this transition, because we are already suffering tremendously, from the climate change in our countries. We know that the continent, that Africa, is probably the region in the world the most affected. Probably I will speak about India as well, but the most affected and the less responsible for it. So we need to be sure that, we have access as well to the fund for the transition, adaptation, and these are tens of billions of dollars which are needed. So local banks can do the local business, can do as well the private sector, because what I am observing in Africa today is that part of this transition of energy is developed by the private sector for their own purpose. And we are financing that, but we finance that as corporate facilities, not as project finance, because we do not have this capacity, long-term financing again, but it's easier to do it. And we know that the grids in many countries in Africa are not today capable to deliver all the energy needed for the transformation and the industrialization of their countries. So we are part of the solution as well by financing private projects in renewable energy, and this is part of our agenda at the same time. So, but also we are financing oil and gas in Africa. I think that Tony spoke about that, Mike spoke about that, Shakira spoke about that. This is a just transition, but we do not have access to international funding for financing oil and gas project in the continent, and we need. It's part of the solution, of course. In responsible, in low carbon technology, this is what it is to be financed, and this is a private sector which is financing that. We do not have enough funding. So we need absolutely the support of the public sector to support us in these financing which are needed. So we need to work together, private and public sector, on a journey, on an agenda, which will give a target, a goal of increasing acceptable energy, fossil fuel energy, we have to say it, with renewable energy, but this is part of the same agenda. And that's really where we have to work together between the public and the private sector.
I think that's a good moment to cross over to you, Shakira. You know, when we're talking about public sector focus on the African energy agenda, and also we heard Thierry there flag the concerns about the continent's grids being capable to deliver what's needed for African industrialization. Could you tell us a bit more about your South Africa's transmission infrastructure program, and break down for us how much potential you see that as being a standard setting project for energy access on the continent, and how do ITPs fit into this?
Thanks, Georgia. This is my favorite topic and my pet subject, actually. So what I'd like to just indicate that when we think of generation, there's been a lot of focus on IPPs on the continent, but transmission has largely been left behind. And without transmission, there can really be no transition without transmission. Africa today, where we find ourselves, is that we have the lowest transmission access per capita in the world. Brazil alone possesses, more transmission lines kilometer-wise than 38 African nations combined, and our per capita grid length is 5 to 7 times lower than that of Brazil's. So we look at Brazil having 0.82 meters per capita, and Africa has 0.072. So this is not, some statistic that we should just be proud to recite, but it's a symptom of the structural inequality that the continent faces, and it's a serious barrier to progress. So what we've done in South Africa, and it's not just us, there are others like Uganda, Kenya, Mozambique, also looking at ITP models, and we introduced independent transmission projects into South Africa. What that means, simply stated, is that the private sector comes in to finance, design, build, in some cases own, and operate transmission infrastructure over a defined concession period. These are long-term concessions, so 25 to 35 years, depending on whether you're looking at the Indian or Brazilian models. And it's really capable of achieving off-balance sheet financing. These partnerships with the private sector are absolutely vital. When we look at South Africa, we need around 14,000 kilometers worth of transmission lines over the next 10 years. Our first ITP project, so phase 1 of our ITP program, is focusing on 1,164 kilometers worth of transmission lines. They're essential to connect and unlock renewable energy. So we've got a situation like many other countries in the world have been through this particular situation where your transmission infrastructure was very much co-located with coal. And the areas where you have the greatest renewable energy endowments, there's no grid. So in the Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, and Western Cape in South Africa, where we have the greatest renewable energy endowments, we don't have the grid. So the bulk of our projects are located in the Northern Cape, and we've placed a huge emphasis on, the localization and industrialization imperatives of this particular program. The 1,164 kilometers, as well as associated substation scope in some instances, a new substation in other instances, it will unlock 3,200 megawatts worth of renewable energy. So we're building on the successes of our independent power producer program. South Africa's IPP program, has already delivered almost 10 gigs worth of generation capacity that is either operational or under construction. And this success, we've seen has mobilized just under 300 billion rand in investment. And of that is, about 52 billion rand in foreign capital. It's also created 94,000 jobs for South Africans across, the construction, operations, and maintenance of IPPs. And we had a local ownership requirement within our IPP program. So that's our independent power producer program. We're now starting our our independent transmission projects program. So in the IPP program, we had a local ownership requirement for consortia of 40%. We've achieved 54% on the IPP program, and we've had about 50% of the project being spent on local content. So we, using some of the lessons learned and the successes of our IPP program, we're seeking to deepen this transformation, by strengthening industrial participation, expanding opportunities for local South Africans across the energy value chain, and also, very importantly, ensuring that local communities directly benefit from the economic and social dividends of our clean energy transition. So we essentially see, for this industrialization to work, there needs to be a clear demand pipeline. When we engage, whether it's our transmission manufacturing industry or whether it's at the EPC level, ITP developers, etc., you need a clear demand pipeline. That's what's going to give you the industrial growth that we very much require. So as government next year, our minister will announce the 5 to 10 year pipeline for the ITP program, so that local industry, it's not just important from a capital mobilization perspective to allocate capital, but also from an industry mobilization perspective, so that factories can expand their manufacturing capacity, we can create much needed jobs in the economy, and so on. So we see 3 levels of localization and industrialization in the ITP program. The first level is at the level of the consortium. Most ITPs function where you have an ITP developer at the consortium level. I mean, there are thousands of examples around the world. We studied India and Brazil extensively. And you have an EPC and O&M provider that is subcontracted by the developer. So you can have local participation at the consortium level. That's the first element. The second element is to involve local EPCs in this particular space. And the third is with regard to local content. So when we look at fabricated steel in South Africa, we have, one company that is able to produce 28,000 tons a month, and that capacity can expand to 56,000. When it comes to cables and conductors, just one factory alone that I visited has a capacity of 14,000 kilometers, worth of cables per year. But when it comes to transformers, there is no class 3 and class 4 transformer, which are the large transformers that you require for for transmission. So those are some of the things that you'll need to build capacity through that demand, but also looking at how we can almost anchor South Africa as a hub to also supply some of these components to the continent, because it's not just South Africa that is, on a race for transmission. It's a global race for transmission. Hence, we have, 18 to 24 month lead times when it comes to things like transformers. So, this blend of public purpose with private participation is important for us in terms of opening space for investment while critically maintaining sovereign control over infrastructure. So we ultimately say that, transmission are they're not just wires, but they're the arteries of your country's economy. They're a symbol of sovereignty. And it's important that, these arteries seek to grow our economies, enable innovation, and ensure that industrialization flows through these arteries.
Thanks so much, Shakir. It's so funny. Like when you hear somebody speak about something that they're passionate about, it's really enjoyable to follow along. Thank you so much for that breakdown. So Tony, when we're talking, Shakir just talked us through there just some of the strides South Africa's making in terms of improving its infrastructure. Where do you see practical renewable energy solutions in that blend? What do you think is ready to be ramped up immediately to measurably address energy access in Africa? And would you say the development pace is exploring its full potential?
Thank you very much for this question. I think I'll carry on with can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me, yeah. I carry on with the passion that Shakira left me with, right? So I love this question because that's one that I regularly get to see, okay, what technology ready to be scaled in the continent? Can you give us some example? And it's a great question. And I would say that for us to meet SDG 7, I think my panelists have obviously mentioned that we're not going to do that with one technology. Let's be clear about that. We need a portfolio that will power both home but also factories. Now, we talked about the 600 million people. So, and we know that, okay, if we need to close this gap within the next 10 years, we talked about 60 million people that we need to electrify every year. That's about the size of South Africa, right? So, and those 60 million people every year. So what we know is that in the continent, a large chunk of it actually in rural areas. In those areas, it's difficult to get the grid out there. So there's actually three things that I want to talk about here again. So I want to talk about the mini grid and the solar home system that actually can scale fast. And as we speak right now, I think we've already managed to reach out more than 5 million people in the continent. Okay, it's not that huge, but definitely I believe if we put a lot more support in there, we can scale that even faster. And with the advent of AI, we can use that to better optimize siting, but also predictive maintenance and enable productive use of SMEs, which is very fundamental to make this sector bankable. And another thing I want to talk about here is the CNI solar, which is actually Africa quiet revolution. Absolutely. Because if we look at the capacity of CNI grew by 30% annually. And now we're talking about 4 gigawatts, right? And in terms of the tariff, because it's important to show as well that it's competitive. So we have tariff averaging between 4.5 to $6 per kilowatt hour. And just for you to understand that, that's about a third of the cost of diesel. Yeah, it's important. And we have 4 key markets, for example, in the continent. So we have Kenya, we have South Africa, we have Ghana, and Nigeria. And the first two, Kenya and South Africa, what they're reporting is like between 20 and 35% OPEX saving. And that one is even more important this start. The uptime gain is about 25%. What does that mean? It means that when you have factories, companies like Heineken in East Africa that build 2.5 megawatt rooftop, or ShopRite in South Africa, with 143 solar sites, or MTN Nigeria, they're really enjoying having this technology now at their disposal in order for them to deliver what they have to deliver to their customers. So that's brilliant. So that's the second part I want to talk about here. And the third part I want to talk about the utility scales project. So I mentioned some of them already. So I talked about the Ben in Egypt. I talked about the Lake Turkana in Kenya, but we can add more in Kenya as well. So geothermal, that's another source we don't mention that much, but we do, but we should, because in the Rift Valley, that's clearly a source that we need to tap into even more. In Kenya, geothermal is about close to 1 gigawatt, right? And that's the single largest source of energy in that country. So how can we make sure that other countries with the same results could exploit that to actually scale things up? That's another thing I can say. And I'm sure we all recently seen the inauguration of the GERD, right? The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, providing 60 gigawatts of power for hydro. So these are the kind of results that we could see operating in the continent right now, and they can help us to really scale up. And if we have those different sources, because renewables, and I actually want to definitely make that clear. So when we sometimes refer to renewables not be able to support industrialization, I don't think it's very accurate, right? Because not all the renewable energy sources are actually intermittent. Yes, solar and wind are intermittent, but not geothermal, not hydro, as I mentioned to you right now. So when we can have every new megawatt, which is lighting homes, but also running machines, that's how we can actually transform access into industrialization. And that's how we can move Africa from the power cut to the powerhouses. So definitely there are lots of examples in the continent right now. And I believe if we look closely, this is how we can take those three that I've mentioned, the mini grid, the CNI solar, the also utility scale, to really scale up things and make sure that renewable brings its fair contribution.
Thank you so much, Tony. So everyone, we don't have much time left. So I'm just going to quickly scoot round everyone. So if you can just make our final answers relatively tight. But Tony, I'm actually going to stay with you there. So, you've talked us through just some of the potential that you see. And also earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the value that you think is still untapped when it comes to domestic and diasporic capital, particularly when it comes to supporting local SMEs in the renewable energy sector. Tell us a bit more about that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying something that could be a little bit controversial. I would say that Africa doesn't lack so much. It doesn't lack so much money. What we lack is actually mechanism. And let me explain that very quickly because I know we're short on time. So Africa needs between 200 and 250 billion per year in terms of clean energy. But what we're getting is, and that represents only 3% of the global flow. That's what we're actually getting. And I believe we can close the gap if we look at, for example, our pension and insurance funds. So if we look at the value there, it's about 1.8 trillion. And only 1.5% of that money actually goes to infrastructure. Maybe if we increase that amount, we can actually liberate some money that can go into infrastructure and more specifically into green energy. So remittance, that's another one. That reached about 100 billion, it was 2023. And this is more than your FDI, but also aid combined. In Nigeria, for example, we have 300 million for diaspora bonds, and it sold out in weeks, showing that there is clearly some investor appetite there. And I could talk about the two other quick examples here. We had the Kenya Acorn Green Bond, 42 million they managed to raise. The Nigeria Green Bond, it financed solar, but also forestry. So when we having this combination of blended finance, for example, CFA or IFC, it helps to cut risk premium by 30 to 40%. So those are the kind of example that I could see that we can bring into the balance to accelerate the conversation here. So the just transition for me shouldn't just be financed by aid or GFI, but by alignment. We should make sure that we bring domestic capital hungry for yield, diaspora capital hungry for impact, and also data to build trust. So that's the combination I see that can really help us make the difference in this in this challenge that we're seeing today.
Thank you so much, Tony and Shakira. What kind of policy tools and and partnerships is South Africa looking at to boost sovereignty, local value change? I mean, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned energy market reforms. How do you make changes that deliver local benefit?
Thanks, Georgia. I mean, look, I know we're short on time, so I'll be quick and just to mention, say, three quick things. So the first is around, in our energy market reform, what the continent is currently experiencing is what, parts of South America and Asia experienced in the 90s. So we're going through similar, whether it's unbundling and other energy market reforms. So we've legislated, the shift from a single buyer system to a competitive multi-market structure. What this means, I wanted to explain it in a little bit more detail, but we've made various legislative amendments, that allow multiple buyers and sellers to trade energy fairly. This really creates the space for local industry and municipalities to participate directly in, this market we've created. I'm just going to use specific examples rather than, attempt to theorize. Second, I've spoken to our ITP program, which is our grid reform agenda, and we really see this as where, industrial opportunity is able to meet that climate ambition. I've mentioned that it's not only about, steel and cables, it's about the grid that powers Africa's next industrial chapter. The third thing I'll mention is we are implementing an industrial policy for the energy transition. So we've got the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, and this essentially seeks to, align our build targets with localization. We've also just released our integrated resource plan for 2025, which essentially seeks to, it's a 2.2 trillion rand investment in South Africa's energy sector. So there, we've got solar, wind, nuclear, gas as key components of South Africa's energy mix going forward. We've linked that to South Africa's Renewable Energy Master Plan, which looks to, simultaneously grow factories for transformers, towers, cables, switchgear, etc. And this is the same logic that drives South Africa's green hydrogen commercialization strategy. Countries like Namibia, South Africa, Mauritania, and others are very well positioned from a green hydrogen perspective, specifically when it comes to derivatives and those sorts of things. So we've got good first mover advantage, to be able to link these to domestic value chains, whether it's in the logistics or green steel development. Sasol, as we know, is looking at green kerosene. Sasol in South Africa, and on partnerships. I mean, we are really deliberate. We're currently, as a backstop, I'll give another example for our ITP program. We've moved away from providing sovereign guarantees. We've taken a policy position as South Africa to move from free guarantees to priced guarantees. So here we're creating a credit guarantee vehicle with the World Bank and other DFIs to essentially backstop that transaction. And this is something that will be implemented alongside the ITP program. So really, these are some of the things we're doing to ensure that every reform we put into place focuses on how you're going to deliver and maximize local benefits. Thanks, Georgia.
Thank you so much, Shakira. And Thierry, what's your take on the priorities in the push to encourage more investment, to make all these plans that we're hearing laid out happen? What would you like to see more offered to get the attention from African private and public sector into energy projects for the continent?
Yeah, I think a lot have been said already, but clearly, for us as a financial sector, what we need to see is more clear policies, stable regulatory frameworks that promote investment in energy projects, a strong governance, a reputation. We need as well probably that politicians involve themselves more in the international forum for defending a taxonomy which is applicable to our continent. Because today, if we apply the taxonomy which has been developed very well, but rather in the north of this planet, we have no possibility to finance reasonably the social and the economical transformation of the continent. This is part, of what we are expecting. And as far as the regulation as well, is how to implement in the continent more exchange, more regional cooperation. I think that the African continent free trade agreement is part of it. And we see what's happening right now with much more cooperation, exchange in the continent. We need absolutely, and we believe strongly in the development of the intra-trade Africa. Again, there is then a nation for the continent to be an exporter of raw material and an importer of finished product. We have everything we need in the continent to be transformed locally and to access to the neighboring country in a continent which will be much more integrated. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Thierry. So, Mike, Thierry set us up nicely there. We've heard about how vital it is that there is cooperation on the continent itself. We've heard a lot of the other speakers set out the work that they're doing from their various sectors to try and encourage local benefit when it comes to this push for industrialization and energy access on the continent. We've set up the landscape when it comes to the point of this, which is putting Africa first. Where does Total Energies sit within this landscape? How is it supporting that? Are you working with or including communities on the continent in terms of building infrastructure, developing skills, technology, all that stuff that's essential to creating sustainable, locally driven energy solutions? What tangibly can you tell us on that front?
Yeah, Georgia. Well, I think the first thing is we need to develop, or the continent needs to develop local capabilities. So if I think about, we've been working in Africa for almost 100 years, and in the countries where we've been for a long time, like in the Gulf of Guinea, Gabon, Nigeria, Angola, Congo, we've been able to over many years develop really highly skilled, highly competent local teams that manage all of our operations. And in fact, now many of these people now are working in our other projects, other places in the world, and will come back to their home countries after some additional experience, to be in senior positions to run some of these businesses. So I think, you need to develop the capability. Obviously you need the investment. We heard from Thierry about access to finance. That's clearly, vital for development of any industry, I think, on the continent, and it's not always been easy. And I think he also mentioned stability and governance. I think they're key as well. I mean, especially in our industry where we're investing in projects which maybe take, 10 years from you spending the first dollar to getting the first dollar back, and then maybe another 20 years of production thereafter. So I think stability is really key. And again, working with local communities. I mean, one of our well-known projects on the continent, is the Tilenga field in Uganda, beside Lake Albert, and the ECOR pipeline, which is a 1,400-kilometer insulated pipeline. So I mean, clearly there we're crossing many different communities. So it's been vitally important for us in that project to develop really good relationships with the communities around where the upstream production is in the Bulisa district in Uganda, but right the way along the pipeline through Uganda, through Tanzania to the port in Tanga. And again, how do we do that? We do that by, providing assistance, providing a lot of training. I mean, investing in the local communities. I mean, we don't want them to be dependent upon us, but we can help them with training on agriculture, on maintenance of different pieces of equipment, so that we do that for a while. Then they're able to stand on their own two legs, and then of course develop that capability for the long term. And I think it was mentioned earlier on as well. I mean, about how ancient that is really important. There can be more investment, less investment, depending on the environment. So one country maybe is not going to have enough activity to justify, keeping, some of the fabrication opportunities in that country. So I think the need to develop regional synergies, so that if there's no projects in Nigeria, there's some in Angola or Congo or in Mozambique or Uganda. So I think we can develop the capabilities, but then I think there needs to be a good lot of cooperation between the countries, so that they can work for each other to kind of have a smoother or a more stable kind of demand for those capabilities. So they don't have to always import. We don't have to always import that capability from overseas.
Thank you so much, Mike. When we talk about cooperation, synergies, every one of our panelists represents a sector that is essential to Africa's push to improve energy access, to pursue a green transition on its own terms. So with my warmest thanks, Mike Sangster, Senior Vice President for Africa for Total Energies, Thierry Ebro, CEO for the Mauritius Commercial Bank, Shakira Karolia, Ministerial Advisor for South Africa's Ministry of Energy and Electricity, and Tony Tiu, CEO of Renewables in Africa. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your work, and thank you all for joining us for the Africa CEO Forum's latest edition of the Fair Climate Transition webinar series. Please do so for our next installment if you can. Till then, take care.